can I just say it's a total pleasure to be here amongst so many wonderful and esteemed individuals from this psychedelic community. I've been a sort of researcher in my spare time. I'm a teacher by profession, and my specialism is physics. Having said that, though, there are certain mergers between physics and consciousness studies and Eastern mysticism which need to be explored. And that's basically, that forms the basis of my work. Today's talk is going to be about dualism. All right, so we're going to talk about the spectre of this perceptual separateness that we endure on a day-to-day basis, and how our dualistic frameworks undermine the true being and the true way of things. That's why I've called it a delinquent stream, and that I'm referring to the criminality of it. We're going to talk in short about these few points. I'll be introducing David Bohm as a physicist whom I really, really look up to. And his concept of wholeness and enfoldment as a principle that underlies all things, the fabric of reality. Further to that, I'll extend that and take the idea of a conscious mind as being an extension of that fabric, and how a universal cosmic consciousness actually expresses itself through us individually. Furthermore, we'll be talking about the swells of reference, so self-referential patterns, self-referential networks, and this natural mirroring that we see in nature at all scales. We'll also be talking about the resulting dissolution of the ego. As a result of this cosmic self-identification, we identify ourselves as a universal being, thereby losing this attachment to our individual ego. I'll be injecting a bit of my quantum hypotheses into this, non-local consciousness and non-local communication as being the fundamental basis and an explanation for this cosmic mind. We'll discuss roughly what's wrong with science today and the dogmas that constrain scientific inquiry. Largely, I would say that science is headed in the right direction, but there are a few changes that can be made, and that will be summed up as a new paradigm in human thought and what we are clearly heading towards. Okay, so, moving on swiftly. David Bohm, in the 70s, came up with a bunch of incendiary papers, and he basically spoke about the universe as being a whole that is constituent within each individual part of the universe. Another way of phrasing this is saying the universe in an atom. You've essentially got a large-scale cosmic structure that is embedded or enfolded within each constituent part of the universe. This universe would look very different from the kind of models that we perceive today. We have networks, and we see mycelial networks, we see networks like the internet, which are highways or pathways of connectedness. And the universe looked at through these pathways of connectedness as a web of interconnected pathways is essentially the basis or the formulation for this. But we can also look back to Eastern mysticism, and Eastern mysticism sums up David Bohm's ideas in one statement: as above, so below. We are using, effectively, self-referential patterns that manifest at different scales, but they are literally the same. It's kind of like a fractal, and I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with fractals. Broccoli is one such example. Trees, snowflakes, naturally occurring fractals, they are self-identical at different scales. You zoom into an image of one, and it's just going to look like the original image. So, as above, so below, this sums up Buddhist thinking and Hindu thinking to a great extent. What is the macro scale is also the micro scale. Now, this is just an example of the kind of fractals that we're talking about. The Mandelbrot Fractal is obviously, it's a mathematical formulation. It uses the idea of imaginary numbers, and it plots that using computer programs on the graph. What you do see, though, are patterns of self-identification, patterns repeating at all individual scales. And you can think of the universe as being this sort of pattern. You try to step outside of it, and then you start zooming in. You're essentially going to see repetitive, recurring patterns. It's this constant mirroring at different scales. Now, Terence McKenna and Dennis McKenna came up with this theory, okay? They called it the holographic mind. All right? And they were not the only originators of this theory. What they said was basically the universe, or the brain, even, can be considered to follow this one formulation. Each part is the sum of all parts. Okay? And I think this fractal shows us that. Each part of the fractal is essentially the whole fractal itself. Now, why does the Bohm's theory of wholeness and this enfolding system wherein the whole is enfolded within each part, why is it so appealing? Why does it actually conjure up a very sort of intuitive sense of being? Well, the reason for that is it actually is validated by other theories within science, namely the holographic principle. The holographic principle talks along the lines that the universe itself is a projection and hologram. And that hologram is a projection from another dimensional space into ours. So what we perceive is not a real substance per se, but it's more kind of like an interference pattern. If you understand how holograms work, you understand that they are essentially rays of light that are interfering with each other, creating a projection or a standing wave. Now, the holographic principle generally deals with that, and it also addresses the fact that holograms, if I take an actual hologram, a physical hologram, and I start breaking it in halves, and I break them, and I break them, and I break them. It could be a picture of a face, it could be a picture of a car, but no matter how many times I break it, each bit or each little part of that hologram will contain some semblance of the original image. The whole is embedded within each part. And that's true of any hologram, and that's actually the physical basis for trying to understand wholeness and enfoldment. So now, we've got patterns that repeat at different scales, we've got the holographic principle, but how do we actually quantify this? How do we even qualify it? Well, science actually has a theory, and it's not a theory as much as a concept, and this concept is called recursion. Now, recursion is initially tricky to get your head around, but there's one image which I feel can explain it really well, and this is one of my favorite images lately. It's a picture of a bird poo in the shape of a pooing bird. Okay? Now, I don't know if this was actually doctored, or if it was sort of fiddled upon, but I would say that brings about the essence of recursion. You've got this repetitive structure at different scales. Another way of representing that is this. In order to understand something, you must first understand it. It's this constant mirroring. It's this self-replication at different scales. And it's the same if you look within a mirror and then see that reflected image in a mirror. And you're going to see this infinite set of hues projected into mirrors. It'll be sort of ad infinitum. So what we see then is recursion as being a physical, or rather a real definition for wholeness and the holographic principle. This is another way to look at it. We have a hand broken up into hands, into hands, into hands. And it's this constant replication and mirroring. So essentially, we're now treating the universe as a self-organized, mirroring, self-replicating system. Okay? Now, why are we doing all this? I mean, what is the purpose of this? Clearly, from previous talks, a lot of it depends on our state of perception, our consciousness. What we perceive to be real is not necessarily what is real, because we create mental constructs and so forth, language being one of them. But I'd just like to give you guys a taste of what actually could be. This is a comparison that's been drawn between a single bundle of nerves and a cluster of supergalaxies, or a supercluster of galaxies. The similarities are astounding. You can think of each cluster of galaxies as being a nerve cell within a greater cosmic celestial brain. You've got an actual picture of a nerve cell versus a computer simulation, but using all the latest models of dark matter, dark energy, gravitational attraction, and so forth. So you've got a perfect, what we can model as almost perfect. And the resemblances are startling. So we've essentially got now the universe starting to be treated as a cosmic brain. But why are we looking at brains then? Because of consciousness. The brain, the human brain itself, is what Hofstadter called totally self-referential, in that it makes projections of an external reality of which it itself is a part of. And so as a result, you've got this total feedback. It's an infinite feedback loop. Your brain is making projections of itself. And then there's layers and layers of complexity to that, because you are then looking at yourself, look at yourself, look at yourself, endlessly, in a constant, endless feedback loop. Here's another way to kind of describe it. It's similar to the infinite mirror. Are you something that's real? Are you something that's tangible? Or are you just a projection? And so this is where the questions start to come in. A large sort of reason why we talk about self-identification and ego is because we are so bound, slavishly bound by our own nervous systems. We are essentially what Huxley says, constrained by our nervous systems to perceive distinctions between everything. But that's not necessarily the case. Maybe we are perceiving something that's not entirely true, and that's probably what Buddha called, Maya, or illusion. So we've got another situation where Alice is heading down the rabbit hole. But which is the real Alice? Is that Alice looking at Alice, or is that Alice looking at Alice looking at Alice? We don't know. The whole point is that whole discovery, that journey of discovery that she went through, was in a way related to her loss of self-identification. The moment she tumbled down that rabbit hole, she was not only lost in her own mind, but she was lost in that cosmic mind that we referred to earlier. So, we can then establish that the single, simple individual minds that we think are regular, everyday stuff are actually probably projections of something else. Now, surely, according to Bohm, who would have said, well, the universe is embedded or enfolded within each one of us, within each atom inside of us, but surely, self-awareness and sort of the swirl of self, where you don't know who you are or where you are at any one point, surely that is merely a pattern revealing the whole to be aware of itself. And so self-awareness is actually awareness that the whole has of its own existence. And that's a large explanation. That's a large, it's a metaphor for what religions and what mystical traditions use as their kind of basis for knowledge. Is that you are actually not you, but you are something greater than you, a higher intelligence even expressing itself through you. Now, that leads to very, very sort of weird paradigms, and the psychedelic experience will amplify that in sort of no small measure. But the psychedelic experience has one common facet across the board, and that's ego dissolution. So you've got the ego dissolving, or some people call it ego death, but it's this transcending of the ego that is essentially the key to this. The moment you realize that you are not you, you can then strip away the self-identifications, you can strip away the abstractions, You can strip away, sometimes even memory. You can strip away everything you are attached to. Okay, so that is the basis for what you would call the meditative state, the Buddha consciousness. Yes, it's not attaching. It's just being. It's that isness that we always refer to in the psychedelic paradigm. And so we've got not just the ego dissolving, but boundaries dissolving as a whole. And our perceptual boundaries dissolving. I think that's the key bit. It's a wonderful thing to have historical quotes. But Terence McKenna sums it up in what I perceive to be like a perfect way. Just give you a moment to read that. He said the ego is very late arriving, and he likens it to a bit of a tumor, really, of growth. The ego is a growth in the human psyche, and it's a leftover or is a residue from our primeval, our primate dominance syndromes. So you've essentially got this idea of me, mine, that's yours, this is mine. And that's the creation of our boundaries. We create boundaries not within the real world, but within our mental constructs of the real world. And then we perceive those mental constructs and we confuse them, we conflate them to actually be the real world. So in effect, we have created this mirage, this illusion, and I think that's what's largely addressed in most psychedelic texts. So now, can you separate the image from the observer? I don't think so. I think boundary dissolution, the boundary dissolution implicitly means that you've got no distinction anymore, no separateness between the observer and what is being observed. The camera is definitely not different from the picture it takes. Now, this sort of broadly encompasses this whole idea of connectedness and wholeness. I mean, wholeness is essentially connectedness. We can treat the universe as one essential field. Quantum field theory talks about it. The universe is vibration. The universe is changes within a fluctuating field. And those changes and those localizations of certain energy patterns is what we perceive to be tangible physical stuff. A particle is no more than just a localization of a vibrating field. It's a concentration, nothing more. And so we've got this idea of connectedness, and we also got ideas of an evidence to show this connectedness. Some evidence includes studies on twins, for example. Now, twins are very, very curious because they share feelings across space and time. There's also been an experiment, I think it was Duane, who basically teased or sort of tweaked some neurons in one twin's head in his brain, and there was an immediate response in the other twin's head in another room. So you're getting this idea of connectedness and sort of across space and time. There's no distinction anymore between what is what. Another way to describe it is through random number generators. Now, random number generators are literally just computers that spit out either zeros or ones. And statistically, you say there's a 50% chance that the next number will be a 0 or the next number will be a 1. A lot of experiments have actually shown now that you can, in fact, influence the outcome of the next number. And people actually project an image of what they perceive that they want the next number to be. And the computer statistically tends to gravitate towards that. So you've got direct influence, mental influence, over something that's totally random kind of phenomenon. I'm just going to quickly skip through some stuff. So other ways in which we kind of see this non-local consciousness is dogs being super aware of when their owners are going to be back home. And there's an immediate correlation between when the owners start to leave wherever they are and head back home, and the dog's alertness and awareness of that fact. The other way to say it is starlings. actually have flock behavior. But there's no hierarchy in that flock. There's no leader of the flock. It's a direct communication, implicit and instantaneous communication that they have, which communicates the behavior of the flock to each individual in that. Another way is leaves actually use quantum superposition, and they sample, for photosynthesis, they sample different pathways for the energy transfer. And they actually try and work out the fastest, most efficient way instantaneously. They do it just sort of without any kind of hesitation. And then entanglement is another sort of quantum mechanical property where particles can literally be separated and be put across the universe at large distances, and they still communicate. They still talk to each other. And this is across space and time, independent. So you register a change to particle 1, and particle 2 immediately registers it, irrespective of the distance between them. This image kind of sums up why. All right? And I would liken this to the universe. I mean, we tend to see the granulations, the pixelations, and that's our natural sort of status quo, you know, that's the way we perceive. But actually, the large-scale image is something that misses us entirely, unless obviously we're under the influence of psychedelics or in a meditative state. And then if you were one eye at one end of that and talking to another eye, it's very easy to see how they would communicate, given that the large-scale structure is essentially what passes that information on. Just quickly, I'm going to skip forward to this idea of time travel. Now, we generally tend to think, yes, when we're looking into space, we're seeing into the past. Starlight takes billions of years to reach us, and therefore we're looking at the state of a star as it was a billion years ago. However, that's not entirely the whole picture. There's certain quantum mechanical experiments that show particles emanating at a point up there and hitting a screen down here will actually go back in time and change their own behavior if there are two observers or detectors at the bottom of behind the screen. These particles are changing their behavior retrospectively. And this is behind the principle called retro-causality. It basically shows that particles are able to go back in time and affect their own behavior. And it's been shown that quantum mechanics shows that antiparticles going backwards in time are essentially the equivalent of real particles, like proper particles, going forwards in time. So we've got this kind of interesting dichotomy where we can go backwards in time and forwards in time, and we would be none the wiser. Alan Watts kind of explains that. I mean, how do we explain cause and effect then? How do we explain the fact that one event precedes another and we don't perceive it the other way? Why is that? Well, are cause and effect two different things? Alan Watts thinks not. He likens the whole image to a cat walking behind a fence, you see. And in the absence of the knowledge that the cat's head is connected to the cat's tail, we always tend to see that the cat's head precedes the cat's tail. That knowledge that they are connected, you would always assume that the head causes the tail. And so that is essentially the basis of our perception of causality. It's a flawed perception, it's an incomplete picture because we fail to see that cause and effect, two separate events, are essentially connected. Now that basically means that time itself is a fallacy. Our perception of it is flawed. And the psychedelic paradigm will show that. We've got this essential time dilation, okay? But we've also got the feeling that there is no past and there is no future. There's just one instant. And that's what, spiritual gurus say is the now, it's the endless, the eternal now. This will always be, and it has always been. And we will register changes through it, but essentially it's only one instant. Everything else is merely a projection. So, I don't think I'm going to have time to basically go over the scientific dogmas, but I'd like to end on one note. Is that in the psychedelic paradigm, when you observe certain events and that boundary dissolution happens, it leads to some very interesting consequences. For example, that your perceptual your perception and your cognition change drastically. And this will actually probably ring a bell for most of you guys. This sort of merging, this kind of waving, this sort of the colors and vividness of the whole perception change drastically and randomly. But also, that's the sort of thing that implies inherent connectedness with everything, and objects cease to be as they were. I can only hope then that this conference goes and actually shows us what we are capable of. There's just one slide I want to end on, and it's this. I hope we can actually just go forward and end on a vibration of love, and actually carry that through with us for as long as we can, because essentially all religions and all customs and traditions talk about love as being the fundamental root of everything. I thank you all, and I will take some questions.